No! Crap! I won't get hurt!
I just want you to hold me and take me home. Please.
I missed you a lot, you know.
What?
What is that?
What?
It's this.
The pain's the size. What should we offer?
He's stronger. So good.
Yeah. There's something to this mouth. We already tried this whole thing back in Flint last summer. Mia made the same thing. Girls taking it hard. This should be good for me. I don't know what is wrong with these people.
Witch hunt. Who would do this? Merman.
A book wrapped in black plastic and bound with wire should be impossible to misunderstand. Everything about it says the same thing: leave it closed. Yet, in Evil Dead, the warning does not behave like protection. It behaves like an invitation. The more aggressively this object tries to keep human hands away, the more powerful the urge to uncover what someone wanted hidden. That contradiction is our first clue, because this film is built around boundaries that appear strong until somebody decides their own judgment matters more. Welcome to the film box, where we look beyond the immediate shock and examine the mechanism working underneath it. If you remember Evil Dead mainly as a relentless display of physical horror, you are not wrong. But you are only looking at the loudest compartment. Beneath the Rain, the isolated cabin, and the escalating nightmare is a story about people who repeatedly fail to recognize when a boundary deserves respect Every film is a box. We open it together. Fate, Alvarez's 2013 Evil Dead, arrived carrying a difficult burden. It inherited one of horror cinema's most recognizable names, a fiercely loyal fan base, and imagery that had already been copied, celebrated, and transformed across decades. Trying to reproduce the personality of Sam Raimi's earlier films would have invited an unflattering comparison. Abandoning that identity completely would have made the title feel unnecessary. Alvarez therefore chooses a more dangerous route. He keeps the essential architecture but changes the emotional pressure inside it. This version does not treat the cabin like a playground for chaotic horror. It treats the place like a sealed wound. The rooms feel contaminated before the characters fully understand why. The surrounding forest seems less like an open landscape than a wall that has grown around them. Even ordinary objects appear to be waiting for the wrong hand to touch them. The film turns familiarity into unease. You may recognize the shape of the story, but recognition offers no comfort. That is where our bound book becomes important. It is not merely a convenient object that pushes the plot forward, it represents the movie's entire system. A warning is seen, the warning is examined, then it is rationalized away. Each step feels small enough to excuse, but together they create a path that cannot easily be reversed. The horror does not arrive because everyone lacks information. It arrives because information is present and still fails to stop human curiosity, pride, guilt, and desperation. The same tension surrounds Mia, played by Jane Levy. She comes to the remote cabin because she is trying to escape a destructive cycle, while the people around her are determined to prevent her from leaving. That setup gives every locked door and blocked path a second meaning. A boundary might be saving her, trapping her, or doing both at once. When fear enters the room, the others cannot immediately agree on whether Mia is suffering from something expected or confronting something impossible. Their reasonable explanation becomes another kind of blindfold. This is what makes the film more interesting than a simple contest between people and an evil force. The characters are also fighting uncertainty. When should loyalty become suspicion? When does support become control? How long should you trust the explanation that makes the most sense when the evidence in front of you keeps changing? Horror thrives in that narrow space between what you know and what you are willing to believe. Antalvarez applies pressure to that space with remarkable commitment. He strips away much of the comic release associated with earlier entries and replaces it with dread, physical exhaustion, and emotional strain. The result is deliberately severe. It wants you to feel that every choice has weight and every ignored signal leaves a mark. Whether that intensity creates meaningful terror or occasionally overwhelms the human story will become part of our investigation. We will follow the film's central clue through its performances, practical craft, visual design, critical reception, hidden connections, and divisive choices. We will examine why some moments feel brutally effective, why others struggle to carry the same emotional force, and how the ending changes the meaning of everything the cabin seems to demand. For now, keep your attention on that sealed book. Someone took extraordinary measures to close it. Yet those measures only advertise the secret inside. Before we break the binding and reveal what follows, we need to understand the film's most clipping trick. It gives its characters a perfectly believable reason to stay exactly where no sensible person would remain. The reason they remain is not foolishness, it is a promise. Mia has tried to break free from substance dependence before, and the people closest to her know that withdrawal will make her desperate to escape. They arrive at the family cabin with a plan. No matter what she says, no matter how frightened or unwell she becomes, they will not help her leave. They believe refusing to listen is the most loving thing they can do. That decision gives Evil Dead its sharpest idea. In most cabin horror films, the question is why anyone would stay after danger becomes visible. Here, the answer has already been established before the danger properly begins. Mia is expected to panic. She is expected to see threats where others see nothing. She is expected to beg for release. The exact behavior that should alert her friends has been defined in advance as something they must ignore. The trap is therefore psychological before it becomes physical. This is far more effective than simply removing every vehicle or destroying every phone. Those devices may isolate the group, but the real lock is their commitment to the plan. Mia's friends are not careless outsiders wandering into a forbidden place for entertainment. They believe they are performing an act of support. If they abandon that commitment too quickly, they risk helping her return to the pattern that brought them here. If they hold their position, they may be dismissing a danger they cannot yet understand. Either choice can be interpreted as betrayal. That is the hook buried inside all the horror imagery. The film takes a responsible intention and corrupts it without changing the intention itself. The group wants Mia to survive. Yet their effort to protect her creates the ideal conditions for nobody to believe her. Love becomes a locked door, and certainty becomes the key that refuses to turn. Jane Levy's presence makes the dilemma convincing because Mia does not enter the cabin as a passive victim. She is alert to everyone's doubts. She knows that her past has damaged her credibility, and she can feel the group quietly measuring every reaction against what they expect withdrawal to look like. Her fear is not limited to the discomfort ahead. She also understands that once the process begins, her own words may lose their authority. Imagine recognizing something deeply wrong and realizing that every attempt to warn the people around you will sound like proof that they should ignore you. The harder you insist, the more completely their explanation seems to fit. That is a uniquely suffocating kind of terror. It removes the safety normally offered by communication. Speaking does not create understanding, it strengthens the wall. The cabin intensifies this problem because it carries unresolved family history. Mia and her brother David are not arriving with a clean relationship or equal trust. His absence during painful periods has left emotional distance between them. He wants to help now, but good intentions cannot instantly repair the moments when he was not there. His return brings affection, guilt, and responsibility into the same room. That mixture affects every decision he makes. So, when circumstances begin to challenge the group's explanation, David is not simply evaluating evidence, he is also evaluating himself. Is he finally standing beside his sister, or failing her again in a new way? Is believing her an act of loyalty, or is refusing to let her escape the stronger form of loyalty? The film keeps tightening that knot until ordinary judgment becomes almost impossible. This also changes how suspense works. You are not merely waiting for the next disturbing event. You are watching the distance grow between what Mia experiences and what everyone else accepts. Each new signal has to fight through the explanation already controlling the room. The question is not only whether the group will recognize the threat, it is whether recognition will arrive before their earlier promise becomes irreversible. And then there is the book. Its warnings seem absolute, but the person examining it treats them as material to be understood. Curiosity disguises itself as intelligence. If Mia's suffering is dismissed because it appears familiar, the book's danger is dismissed because it appears impossible. One character trusts ordinary logic too much. Another believes hidden knowledge can be controlled through study. Different impulses lead toward the same mistake. Both assume the unknown will respect the categories they bring into the cabin. Put those details together and the mechanism becomes visible. Evil Dead does not trap its characters by making them irrational. It gives each of them a reason that feels defensible, then places those reasons in a situation where confidence becomes dangerous. The film asks how long you would cling to a sensible explanation while reality became increasingly senseless around you. That question is what keeps the story from becoming a simple exercise in escalation. Beneath the intensity is a cruel test of belief. A warning can be obvious and still go unheeded. A person can tell the truth and still sound unreliable. A promise can begin as love and end as confinement. To understand how Alvarez built that test without losing the identity of Evil Dead, we have to step outside the cabin for a moment and look at the creative decisions that brought this particular nightmare to the screen. That creative path begins with a filmmaker who was not the obvious safe choice for a valuable horror property. Evil Dead was Fede Alvarez's first feature film. His international breakthrough came through Panic Attack, a short made in Uruguay that showed a city overwhelmed by enormous machines. Alvarez has since described that short as the word that gave him his career and led him to Evil Dead. Sam Raimi selected a director known less for a long resume than for the force of a few minutes of imagery. That first fact matters because the finished film has the urgency of someone treating the opportunity as a single decisive shot. Araval does not approach the cabin cautiously, as if preserving a museum object. He pushes towards scale, velocity, and physical pressure. The story is small in geography, but the sensations are enormous. Sound expands through cramped rooms. Ordinary tools acquire frightening weight. The forest appears capable of swallowing the entire frame. The same instinct that made a low-budget short feel much larger than its resources is redirected inward. Instead of destroying a city, Alvarez makes one cabin feel like a complete collapsing world. The second important fact is that the original creative guardians did not disappear when the new filmmaker arrived. Raimi, producer Robert Tappert, and Bruce Campbell all served as producers, while Antares co-wrote the screenplay with his longtime collaborator Roldo Sykes. This created a useful tension behind the camera. The new film had access to people who understood the franchise's essential machinery, but its director still needed room to build a separate identity. You can feel that negotiation in the movie's relationship with recognition. Certain camera movements, objects, and spatial arrangements awaken memories of the earlier films, yet they do not arrive merely to earn applause. Alvarez often takes something familiar and removes the playful release attached to it. Recognition becomes anticipation. If you know the franchise, an object can make you uneasy before it is used. If you do not, the staging still gives it menace. The references function as loaded evidence rather than decorative nostalgia. This is also why the film's seriousness feels intentional instead of accidental. Raimi's series gradually became famous for combining horror with wild physical comedy, especially through Campbell's performance as Ash. Arthurus could not reproduce that rhythm with a new cast without inviting imitation. His solution was to travel back toward the raw discomfort of the original premise, then make that discomfort contemporary. The old framework remains visible, but a different emotional mechanism moves inside it. The third fact explains why the danger has such a tangible presence. During production, Alvarez emphasized in-camera makeup and physical effects whenever practical execution was possible. Set visit interviews with the effects team describe an early goal of keeping the transformations grounded in realism rather than allowing them to become exaggerated visual jokes. Genevieve also discussed undergoing a full body casting process so the crew could build prosthetic elements for her role. That practical commitment changes the performances. An actor responding to weight, texture, temperature, restricted movement, and a transformed face is not working against empty space. The material affects posture and breathing. It changes how another performer looks at them. Even when digital work assists the final image, the scene begins with something physically present. Your eye senses contact between bodies, surfaces, and objects, which makes the cabin feel less like a designed spectacle and more like a hostile environment. It also supports the film's central idea about warnings. Physical effects preserve consequence. A choice does not vanish when the shot ends. Its evidence remains in the room, on clothing, and across the performer's exhausted expressions. The cabin seems to record every error. By making the aftermath visible, the production prevents the story from resetting emotionally. Each new compartment opens inside a space already ordered by the last one. The fourth fact concerns that space itself. The production worked in New Zealand using a forest location for the cabin exterior while recreating the cabin on a soundstage. Production designer Robert Gillies and his team built the interior again so Alvarez and cinematographer Aaron Morton could move the camera and control the increasingly complicated action more freely. That split between location and stage is invisible in the ways that matter. Outside, the trees establish genuine depth and damp isolation. Inside, the constructed environment permits walls, angles, and practical components to cooperate with the camera. The cabin can feel cramped without limiting the filmmakers to flat coverage. Morton's lens can investigate hallways, descend toward hidden areas, or hold on a doorway long enough to turn empty space into a threat. More importantly, rebuilding the cabin allowed the production design to treat it as a system rather than a backdrop. Its rooms connect like compartments in the movie's box. The main idea offers a fragile illusion of community. Narrow passages break that group into vulnerable pieces. The lower space holds evidence nobody wants brought into the light. Every vertical movement carries meaning. Going downward means entering buried history, while attempting to move outward means confronting the promise that keeps Mia there. The fifth and most revealing fact returns us to our chosen clue. The art department created 3 physical copies of the Book of the Dead. According to Gillies, each used a silicone flesh-like cover with hair worked into it, and the pages were detailed by hand. He and Alvarez designed this new version together, with Remy and Tappert approving it. They intentionally avoided simply copying the famous face on the earlier book while trying to preserve the sense of an object shaped by a long, corrupted history. Look at what that production decision accomplishes. The book feels handled before the characters ever touch it. Its handwritten notes suggest that other people encountered the same danger, tried to understand it, and left behind layers of panic disguised as instruction. Different marks compete across the pages. Some appear investigative, others appear desperate. Knowledge has accumulated, but wisdom has not. Every previous owner seems to have added information without finding a reliable way to stop the next person from repeating the mistake. The wire surrounding it therefore becomes more than an aggressive prop detail. It represents a final failed argument of everyone who came before. Words were not enough, images were not enough, and warnings were not enough, so someone attempted to make access physically painful. Yet, the elaborate barrier only makes the contents feel more important. The craftsmanship turns curiosity into a visible force before anything overtly supernatural needs to happen. These 5 production choices connect cleanly. A first-time feature director brings the scale and hunger of a breakthrough short. The original creators preserve the franchise's foundation without forcing a copy. Physical effects make consequences remain in the room. A location and stage combination turns the cabin into a controllable pleasure chamber, and a handmade book converts exposition into texture. None of those decisions works alone. Together they explain why the film feels both inherited and newly dangerous. Alvarez is not simply repeating the warning left by the original Evil Dead. He is asking whether a modern production can reopen that forbidden object, change what lies inside, and still make you feel that opening it carries a cost. Now that we can see the hands that constructed the box, we can identify exactly what kind of film they placed inside it and why this 2013 return exists beyond the commercial attraction of a recognizable title. Evil Dead is a 2013 supernatural horror film, directed by Fede Alvarez and written by Alvarez with Rodo Sykes, drawing its foundation from Sam Raimi's 1981 film, The Evil Dead. Jane Levy leads the cast as Mia, joined by Shiloh Fernandez as her brother David, Lou Taylor Pucci as Eric, Jessica Lucas as Olivia, and Elizabeth Blackmore as Natalie. 5 people, 1 remote cabin, 1 forbidden book. On paper, the arrangement looks almost deliberately basic. That simplicity is not a lack of ambition. It is the structure that allows the film to concentrate its energy. Instead of building an expansive mythology or scattering attention across numerous locations, Alvarez reduces the story to a few relationships, a contained environment, and a sequence of choices that become progressively harder to reverse. Calling the film a remake is accurate in one sense, but incomplete in another. It returns to the central architecture of Raimi's original. Young adults enter an isolated cabin, an ancient text is disturbed, and a hostile presence turns the location against them. Yet this version does not attempt to recreate the earlier characters or imitate Bruce Campbell's Ash. It constructs a new group around a new emotional reason for entering the woods. That distinction explains why the film exists creatively. A direct copy would only demonstrate how influential the original had become. Alvarez instead asks what the premise might feel like if played with modern technical control, severe physical realism, and almost no comic distance. He preserves the engine but changes the fuel. The original film grew out of young filmmakers stretching limited resources through invention, aggressive camera movement, and fearless practical experimentation. The 2013 version inherits that appetite for tactile horror while benefiting from a larger professional production. Its challenge is to maintain rawness when the images are more polished. Alvarez answers by using that polish to intensify discomfort rather than smooth it away. The surfaces are clearer, the spaces are more controlled, and the consequences feel harder to escape. Genre labels only describe part of what he creates. This is supernatural horror, possession horror, and body horror. But it is also a chamber drama about damaged trust. The cabin keeps the characters physically close while exposing how emotionally separated they already are. They share a purpose without sharing the same understanding of the past. Mia sees the trip as a necessary fight for control of her life. David sees it partly as a chance to fulfill a responsibility he previously avoided. Their friends enter with varying amounts of confidence, knowledge, and patience. At its heart, then, Evil Dead is about what happens when an old wound is treated in a place that contains older wounds of its own. Mia wants to close one destructive cycle. The cabin opens another. Her struggle requires everyone to resist the temptation to run, while the growing threat makes remaining increasingly dangerous. The premise creates two competing definitions of survival, and the characters cannot easily determine one has replaced the other. That emotional foundation is the film's best update. Addiction is not used merely as a fashionable explanation for bringing people together, it affects the logic of every early decision. It gives Mia vulnerability without reducing her to weakness. She has already chosen to confront something powerful inside herself before the external nightmare begins. Her friends may doubt her perception, but she possesses an endurance they consistently underestimate. Jane Levy carries much of that weight. Her performance must communicate physical distress, fear, anger, shame, and determination, while the people around Mia keep interpreting those emotions through their own expectations. Fernandez plays David as someone whose concern is real but compromised by guilt. Pucci gives Eric the restless intelligence required to open the movie's forbidden compartment, while Lucas and Blackmore help create the temporary sense that this intervention has a rational plan behind it. Spoiler free, the film succeeds most when it turns physical intensity into an extension of emotional pressure. Its craft is confident, its pacing is forceful, and its commitment never appears embarrassed by the extremity of the material. It does not always give every supporting character enough depth to make each loss land equally. Some decisions serve momentum more clearly than psychology. But the central relationship gives the chaos a human line to follow. This is not the most accessible entry for someone who dislikes sustained intensity or disturbing physical imagery. The film rarely offers relief once his mechanism begins moving. It is designed to exhaust as much as frighten. Those seeking the strange humor and adventurous personality of later installments in the franchise may find its seriousness limiting. But if you appreciate horror built from practical texture, oppressive sound, contained locations, and characters trapped by believable emotional decisions, this film deserves attention. It is especially compelling for anyone interested in how a remake can respect recognizable material without pretending that relevance alone creates value. Alvarez honors the original by accepting the same challenge. Make a simple cabin feel like the most dangerous place imaginable. Why should you care about another story involving a forbidden book? Because this one understands that opening the object is only the visible mistake. The deeper mistake is believing that knowledge automatically gives you control. Every mark inside the book says somebody learned what the danger was. None of those marks proves they learned how to defeat it. The official description tells us what kind of film we are opening. The first minutes tell us how it wants to be felt. Before the central group can even settle into the cabin, Alvarez plants an atmosphere of contamination, interrupted recovery, and buried history that changes the temperature of every ordinary interaction. The first sensation is disorientation. A frightened young woman moves through the forest as if escaping one danger, only to discover that the people waiting for her are not rescuers. Alvarez withholds the larger context and lets the scene rearrange itself around you. What initially resembles pursuit becomes containment. What appears to be cruelty reveals a desperate purpose. Before the main story has even begun, the film teaches you that surface appearances cannot be trusted. The opening is harsh, but its most effective quality is not the physical threat. It is the instability of your judgment. You enter the scene without enough information, form an immediate conclusion, and then watch that conclusion break. This becomes a miniature version of everything that follows. Mia's friends will also see behavior, assign a familiar explanation, and resist changing their minds. The prologue quietly places you in the same vulnerable position. You believe what the available evidence seems to show, but the evidence is incomplete. That choice immediately separates this film from the playful energy many people associate with the franchise. There is no reassuring hero, no wink or comic release to guide you through the darkness. The opening presents evil as something intimate and corrupting. It does not merely attack a body, it distorts recognition between people who should know each other. A familiar face becomes unreliable, and the fiction becomes a weakness the threat can exploit. Then the film closes this brief nightmare with a title card that arrives like an impact rather than an introduction. The transition makes a declaration. Alvar understands the name he has inherited, and he wants you to know that this version will pursue Dread without apology. The title does not gently welcome you into a franchise. It seems to challenge you to continue. What follows is deliberately quieter. Mia, David, Eric, Olivia, and Natalie arrive at the cabin with a purpose grounded in real pain rather than supernatural expectation. Their early conversations carry the awkwardness of people attempting to perform unity before they have rebuilt trust. They speak, smile, and organize the intervention, but the room never feels relaxed. David's return has not erased his absence. Mia's decision has not erased previous attempts. Everyone wants to believe this occasion will be different, yet nobody possesses proof. That emotional discomfort makes the cabin feel wrong before any impossible event occurs. The building is not introduced as a blank holiday retreat. It belongs to family memory. Its deterioration suggests neglected responsibilities and time allowed to gather without care. David moves through a place connected to his past while behaving like someone who no longer completely belongs there. Mia, meanwhile, is entering both a physical location and a test she fears she has already failed before. The atmosphere is damp, cold, and strangely airless. Alvarez uses the forest's natural openness to create enclosure. Trees block rather than invite movement. Mud and rain remove any sense of comfort associated with wilderness. Inside, muted colors and worn surfaces make the cabin seem exhausted. Nothing shines, nothing offers escape from the feeling that the group has arrived too late to restore what has been abandoned. One of the earliest hooks is something almost ordinary, an unpleasant smell. It creates a small mystery before the larger one reveals itself. Smell is especially effective in horror because cinema cannot provide it directly. The characters' reactions force you to imagine what the room contains. That unseen contamination makes the cabin feel physically invasive. The threat enters through suggestion before it enters through image. Then evidence begins to accumulate. The environment contains signs that somebody used this place for a purpose the newcomers did not expect. Objects are arranged with intention. Damage appears less random than it first seemed. A concealed area turns a cabin from an abandoned family property into a location with a recent, disturbing history. The characters have not discovered the danger yet. They have discovered proof that another story happened here before theirs. This is where the first 10 minutes become difficult to look away from. The film gives you two mysteries that move toward each other. One is human. Can Mia endure the process? And can this damaged group support her without repeating old failures? The other is environmental. What happened inside the cabin? And why was its most important object restrained so aggressively? Neither question requires immediate spectacle. Their collision creates suspense. The premise initially suggests a familiar modern recovery drama. A group isolates someone they love so she can survive the worst stage of withdrawal. The franchise name promises supernatural chaos. Alfred does not rush to choose between those modes. He lets each one contaminate the other. Mia's physical distress can be interpreted through her addiction, while the cabin's warning signs can be dismissed as evidence of unknown people behaving irrationally. The ordinary explanation remains strong enough to delay acceptance of the extraordinary one. That delay is what hooked me. The film does not need the characters to announce that they are trapped. It establishes a situation in which living would feel like failure. The group has emotionally locked the exit before the story needs to close it by force. Every early conversation strengthens that invisible barrier, and every hidden detail tests whether the promise can survive contact with something nobody prepared to confront. The opening also creates a useful tension between polish and filth. Aaron Morton's cinematography is controlled, but the world inside the frame feels unstable. The compositions are carefully constructed, yet their surfaces are stained, wet, damaged, and neglected. This contrast prevents the movie from appearing casually chaotic. You sense a precise filmmaking intelligence, arranging an environment that seems to be losing order. Most importantly, the film earns its first escalation through atmosphere rather than impatience. It gives the cabin a history, the group unfinished emotional business, and the forbidden object a visible trail of resistance. By the time curiosity moves closer to that book, opening it no longer feels like a random mistake written merely to start the plot. It feels like the final link in the chain of people mistaking access for permission. The prologue showed that one family had already learned the cost of recognizing evil too late. The cabin sequence now places a new group beside the same warning system without giving them the knowledge required to read it. The feeling is not simply that something bad will happen. It is that the mechanism has already started quietly while everyone still believes they are in control. To see how Alvarez sustains that feeling, we need to examine the camera, light, color, editing, and production design that keep tightening the cabin around its occupants before the story openly reveals its hand. Alvarez and cinematographer Aaron Morton make the cabin feel dangerous by giving camera two conflicting personalities. At times, it moves like a force with intention, gliding through the forest or approaching a space before any character understands what is there. At other moments, it becomes rigid and observant, holding still while the person inside the frame realizes that something has changed. The tension comes from never knowing which personality will take control. The moving shots acknowledge one of the franchise's most famous visual ideas. Evil can be represented through motion itself. A camera rushing close to the ground turns the landscape into a point of view without requiring a visible creature. Speed becomes identity. The audience does not need to see what is approaching because the movement communicates hunger, direction, and confidence. Until Juarez uses this technique selectively. If every scene raced forward, the effect would become familiar. He contrasts aggressive movement with frames that seem almost too calm. A doorway remains open behind someone. A figure occupies one area while an apparently empty section of the image receives equal visual importance. Your attention begins scanning the negative space, searching for a change the character may not notice. That framing turns the cabin into an evidence board. Walls divide people into separate boxes. Door frames create images within images. Windows promise visibility but rarely provide useful safety. Characters frequently appear trapped by the architecture before the story physically traps them. The composition says that connection is possible. The group may be only one room apart, yet the barriers between those rooms make assistance uncertain. The camera's distance also changes with the group's psychological stability. Early scenes allow enough space for several characters to share the frame. They appear capable of acting collectively, even if emotional tension already exists among them. As control weakens, tighter compositions isolate faces and bodies. The group stops reading as a unit. Each person becomes a separate reaction inside a location that benefits from separation. Close-ups are especially effective because Alvarez does not use them only for fear. He uses them for interpretation. A character looks at Mia and tries to decide whether her behavior fits the expected explanation. Mia looks back and recognizes that doubt. The edit between those faces creates a silent argument. Neither image alone contains the whole meaning. The mechanism appears in the cut. Brian Shaw's editing gives the film an escalating pulse without turning every sequence into rapid fragmentation. The early rhythm allows unease to collect. Shots linger long enough for you to inspect the environment, while transitions plant visual information that will matter later. When the pressure increases, the cutting becomes sharper, but the geography generally remains understandable. You know where a door leads, where a hidden area sits beneath a room, and how far one character may be from another. That clarity is essential. Confusing space can produce momentary panic, but understood space creates anticipation. If you know what lies beyond a wall, you can fear a character moving toward it. If you remember where an object was placed, its reappearance carries meaning. The editing therefore transforms continuity into suspense. The cabin's layout becomes part of your memory, and the film repeatedly uses that memory against you. The color palette avoids inviting warmth. Browns, dirty greens, cold grays, and beacon natural tones dominate the environment. Wood should suggest shelter, but here it appears aged and damp. Green should suggest life, yet the forest green feels heavy, almost airless. Even skin tones are placed against surfaces that make everyone appear slightly drained before the real ordeal begins. Red enters with a different force because the surrounding palette has been restrained. It does not behave like decorative genre styling. It becomes a visual alarm. As that color occupies more of the frame, the film's world seems to lose its remaining neutrality. The progression is not merely from clean to stained. It is from a place where ordinary explanations still function to one where denial is visually impossible. Lighting strengthens that decline. Practical sources within the cabin create pockets of visibility rather than complete illumination. Lamps and overhead fixtures reveal enough to orient you while leaving corners uncertain. Light does not defeat darkness, it negotiates with it. This keeps the characters visible without making the location feel open or safe. Exterior light is equally unforgiving. Overcast skies flatten the promise of daylight, while rain reduces distance and definition. Daytime fails to provide the emotional reset horror films often allow. The cabin remains enclosed even when the sun should broaden the world. Night does not introduce the danger so much as complete a process already underway. Production design supplies the visual history beneath these choices. The cabin contains worn furniture, exposed textures, old family associations, and evidence of more recent intrusion. It does not look like a generic structure, constructed solely for destruction. Its damage arrives in layers. The oldest layer belongs to family memory, another to abandonment, and the latest to people who attempted to confront what the book released. The book itself concentrates the entire design philosophy into one prop. Its irregular pages, handwritten additions, disturbing illustrations, and improvised restraints make it seem authored by many frightened hands rather than manufactured for film. The object carries no clean division between text and warning. The same page can appear informative from one angle and desperate from another. Reading becomes visually indistinguishable from trespassing. Sound and image collaborate even before the dedicated sound analysis arrives later. The camera may show an ordinary object while the soundtrack gives it unusual weight. A small movement receives a sharp texture. A distant disturbance occupies more mental space than its source occupies inside the frame. This imbalance keeps the environment active even when nothing visible is moving. The visual texture remains remarkably tactile because polished photography never removes the roughness of the materials. Wet earth clings, wood splinters. Fabric absorbs, metal reflects brief cold highlights. Prosthetic work catches the same light as the performers around it. Everything appears to belong to one physical world, which prevents the most extreme images from feeling detached from the earlier realism. Alvarez also understands the value of visual setup. Objects are introduced before they become important. The film lets you register their location, shape, or function without announcing the future connection. When the story returns to them, recognition creates dread. This is not random foreshadowing scattered for repeat viewing. It is a practical chain of cause and consequence built into the design. Put all these choices together and the cabin stops functioning as a container. Camera movement gives it appetite. Framing divides its occupants. Editing teaches you its geography. Color records the loss of control. Lighting limits certainty. Production design fits every compartment with evidence. The technique matters because the story never has to pause and explain that the situation is tightening. You can see the space closing through the way it is photographed. And once that visual mechanism is established, The characters' central wants and mistakes can push the story forward with very little assistance from coincidence. Mia's central desire is simple to describe and difficult to achieve. She wants to regain control of her life. The cabin is chosen because it removes familiar escape routes and places her among people who can stop her from abandoning the attempt. That plan depends on trust, but trust is the one resource this group does not possess in equal amounts. David has returned after being absent during important family suffering. Mia needs his support, yet his presence also reminds her that he was not there when she needed him before. Olivia approaches the situation with professional confidence, believing she can distinguish withdrawal from a genuine medical crisis. Eric appears more observant, but also more willing to cross intellectual boundaries. Natalie supports David without sharing the siblings' history. Everyone enters with a different role. Nobody enters with the complete picture. The first obstacle is therefore not the supernatural force. It is the group's belief that they have already defined what the coming crisis will look like. They expect physical distress, emotional volatility, and demands to leave. Once those expectations are fixed, any warning from Mia must pass through them. Her credibility has been reduced before she makes a single extraordinary claim. Meanwhile, the smell inside the cabin leads the group toward a concealed lower area. What they find there suggests that someone performed a violent ritual involving animals and fire. The discovery should end their stay, but the evidence is disturbing without being immediately understandable. It belongs to an unknown event that appears finished. Because the threat seems to exist in the past, the group treats cleaning the space as more practical than fleeing it. That choice reveals a recurring human weakness. People often respond more strongly to visible danger than to unexplained evidence of danger. The basement is horrifying, but it is quiet. Silence feels like completion. The group assumes that whatever happened has already left. Eric then discovers the bond book. He removes its restraints, studies its pages, and reconstructs words that the book repeatedly warns him not to speak. He does not behave like someone attempting harm. He behaves like someone convinced that information becomes safe once it is understood. His mistake is not curiosity alone, it is the assumption that reading is passive. The film makes that distinction essential. Some knowledge changes only the person who receives it. This knowledge changes the environment. Eric crosses a boundary without believing in the boundary, yet disbelief provides no protection from the consequence. The mechanism does not require intention, it requires completion. Mia soon senses a presence in the woods and attempts to leave. Her desperation matches exactly what the others predicted, which means the supernatural threat is protected by the recovery plan. When she drives away, the attempt fails and the surrounding landscape seems to redirect her toward the danger. The forest is no longer scenery. It has become an extension of the force released by the book. Her encounter outside the cabin marks the first major escalation. The threat uses Mia's appearance against her, turning identity into a weapon. She returns physically and emotionally overwhelmed, but her account sounds impossible to people prepared for an ordinary breakdown. Their skepticism is understandable, which is precisely why it is so dangerous. Olivia interprets Mia's condition through withdrawal. David sees the promise he made and refuses to become the brother who leaves again. Eric has not yet accepted that his private experiment caused anything real. Each explanation protects its owner from guilt. Believing Mia would require Olivia to surrender certainty, David to revise his idea of support, and Eric to face responsibility. The story is not asking why they failed to recognize an obvious horror. It is showing how recognition threatens the identities they brought with them. As Mia's behavior changes, the group's intervention becomes confinement. They believe they are preventing her from escaping the recovery process, while she understands that remaining in the cabin means exposure to something worse. The same locked boundary now has opposite meanings, depending on which side of it you occupy. For David, it represents commitment. For Mia, it represents abandonment disguised as care. Then the weather destroys the practical route out. This external barrier arrives only after the emotional barrier has done its work. The film has already shown that the characters would not leave when they could. By the time they agree that escape may be necessary, the choice has been removed. Cause precedes trap. That sequencing matters. If the road had vanished immediately, the characters would simply be victims of circumstance. Because they first choose to remain, the isolation carries moral weight. The cabin closes after they fail to open themselves to the evidence. Mia's transformation forces the threat into the open, but knowledge does not restore unity. It divides the group further. They can no longer rely on the withdraw explanation, yet they do not share a new plan. The book offers fragments of rules and warnings rather than a clean solution. Eric reads the pages differently now. What looked like mysterious symbolism becomes a record of procedures, consequences, and previous failures. The object has changed without changing at all. This is the clue trail turning back on itself. The barriers around the book initially seemed excessive because Eric did not believe the danger. Now they appear inadequate because the danger has already escaped. He keeps reading because the act that caused the problem may also contain the only path towards stopping it. Curiosity becomes guilt driven investigation. Inside the cabin, the force works by separating attention. It exploits compassion, hesitation, and the instinct to approach someone who appears injured or afraid. Familiar voices and faces become unreliable evidence. Every attempt to help carries the possibility of opening another route for harm. This gives the escalating confrontations more meaning than simple survival. The characters must decide when a loved one is still reachable and when recognition itself has become a trap. Waiting too long risks everyone. Acting too quickly means abandoning the person they came to save. The supernatural threat turns empathy into a tactical disadvantage while daring the group to surrender it. Olivia's knowledge cannot contain what is happening. Natalie's loyalty draws her deeper into David's crisis. Eric's intelligence becomes increasingly useful only after his first decision has made usefulness necessary. Their traits do not suddenly reverse. The story takes each quality that seems stabilizing and exposes its limit. Mia remains the center even when others attempt to control the situation. Her battle with addiction and the cabin's invasion begin reflecting each other. But the parallel is not suggesting that dependency is literally demonic. The connection is structural. Both forces isolate her, weaken other people's trust in her, and attempt to make her body feel like something she no longer commands. That is why the film's physical horror has an emotional purpose when it works best. It externalizes loss of agency. Mia's struggle is not merely to remain alive, it is to recover ownership of herself while everyone around her debates what version of her they are seeing. David's obstacle becomes increasingly personal. He came to the cabin to prove that this time he would stay. But staying is no longer automatically virtuous. Loyalty cannot be measured by physical presence alone. He must recognize Mia accurately, accept what he previously dismissed, and choose her welfare over the comforting idea that his original promise was enough. The consequences spread because recognition always arrives one step behind the threat. When the group finally accepts one rule, the situation has already changed. When they secure one space, another becomes vulnerable. When an object appears capable of protection, it also introduces a new risk. The film creates momentum by making every solution incomplete. Eric's examination of the book eventually reveals that the force is not acting randomly. The earlier images and warnings describe a process. Individual suffering is part of a larger count, and the cabin is moving toward a final release. This discovery changes the story from escape to prevention. Surviving the night is no longer sufficient if survival allows the mechanism to finish. The information also creates a terrible contradiction. The group's first goal was to keep Mia alive through a painful recovery. The book now suggests that stopping the force may require them to destroy the person they came to save. Evil does not merely threaten Mia. It attempts to make everyone else complete its work by convincing them that sacrifice is the only rational response. David refuses to accept that conclusion without searching for another way. This is where his guilt begins developing into responsibility. Guilt asks how he can compensate for the past. Responsibility asks what Mia needs now. The difference is action guided by her survival rather than his self-image. He and Eric try to interpret the book's methods while the cabin continues reducing their options. Fire, bodily destruction, and burial appear as possible ways to cleanse the possession. but each method carries uncertainty and terrible cost. The text records outcomes, not reassurance. It never guarantees that following its instructions will restore what has been lost. The book functions like a malicious contract. It gives enough information to inspire action while withholding enough certainty to make every action frightening. Eric opened it because he wanted to know what it contained. Now everyone is trapped inside the consequences of that knowledge, searching the same pages for permission to hope. By this stage, the original recovery plan has been completely inverted. The friends intended to prevent Mia from leaving until she could return to herself. Now they must determine whether any part of her remains reachable and whether holding her inside is preserving her or serving the Force. The promise that kept them together has become the question tearing them apart. Yet the film plants one crucial possibility. If the threat exploits despair, then refusing to treat Mia as permanently lost becomes an act of resistance. David's greatest test is not whether he can overpower what she has become. It is whether he can believe in the person beneath it after every visible sign tells him not to. That choice connects the family story to the supernatural mechanism. The book is surrounded by warnings because previous people responded to fear with containment and destruction. David has spent much of the film repeating that pattern, emotionally locking Mia away, defining her condition from outside, and deciding what her words mean before hearing them. Saving her requires more than choosing the correct procedure. It requires breaking the habit of treating a person as a problem to be controlled. The cabin has taken their strengths, exposed their failures, and made each delayed realization costly. The escape route is gone. The group is fractured. The book's process is approaching completion. David finally understands that survival depends on reversing the story's first assumption. Mia is not the one they must refuse to believe. She is the one they must refuse to abandon. He now has a desperate plan that could free his sister or complete the tragedy, and this is the moment the box opens completely. What Evil Dead does brilliantly begins with Jane Levy. The film asks her to perform several versions of Mia without making them feel like disconnected demonstrations. Mia arrives defensive but determined. She knows the others expect her to fail, and that knowledge places tension beneath even her calmest moments. Letty communicates the effort required to remain composed before the supernatural threat adds an entirely different kind of pressure. The scene that proves her control comes when Mia returns from the forest and desperately tries to persuade everyone to leave. Her fear is immediate, but it is not vague. She searches faces for belief, modifies her explanation when she senses resistance, and becomes angrier as concern turns into restraint. Levy makes Mia's desperation readable without simplifying it. You can understand why she appears unreliable to the others while also feeling how terrifying their disbelief is from her position. That double perspective is difficult to sustain. If Mia seemed completely rational, her friends would appear foolish. If she seemed entirely incoherent, the emotional injustice would disappear. Levy holds both possibilities in the same performance. Her breathing, eye movement, and sudden changes in energy allow withdrawal and supernatural terror to overlap until the characters can no longer separate them. Later, when the hostile force speaks and acts through Mia, Levy changes her physical rhythm. The tension in her body becomes unnaturally controlled. Her attention settles on people with a confidence Mia did not possess earlier. The transformation is disturbing because traces of familiarity remain visible. The threat does not replace her with an unrelated monster. It uses the face her friends want to recognize. The story construction supports this performance by turning skepticism into a time mechanism. The script gives the group a credible reason to doubt Mia, then gradually removes that reason as evidence becomes undeniable. Each stage arrives too late to prevent the next consequence. This creates escalation without relying entirely on characters making random mistakes. The best structural decision is placing recovery at the center of the setup. It solves several common problems in one movement. It explains why the group chooses isolation, why they promise not to leave, why Mia's warnings are questioned, and why David's commitment carries emotional significance. The premise is not a thin excuse for reaching the cabin. It continues shaping decisions long after arrival. Alvarez's direction is equally effective when it gives physical objects narrative memory. The book Trapdoor, decal, tools, wires, and cabin fixtures do not simply enter the frame at the instant the plot needs them. They are introduced, positioned, and allowed to remain in your mind. When their function changes, the recognition produces tension before the action begins. The visuals also understand the difference between intensity and visual confusion. Even during frantic moments, the film usually preserves enough spatial clarity for you to anticipate movement. You know who is separated, which obstacle stands between them, and where danger may emerge. That knowledge makes the sequence harder to endure because you can see the possible connection before the character does. Practical effects strengthen this clarity. The performers interact with tangible materials, so motion has resistance and consequence. A door bends under pressure. A tool must be lifted and controlled. Clothing, walls, and floors retain evidence from earlier confrontations. The environment becomes progressively less neutral, as if the cabin itself is documenting the group's failure. The movie's sound design may be its most relentless technical achievement. It treats small sounds as warnings: wood shifts, metal strains, breath changes. A distant movement becomes sharply pleasant because the soundtrack isolates its texture. The film often lets you hear contact before showing its full result, forcing imagination to complete the sensation. Roque Baños' score does not merely announce fear. It builds a sense of ritual and approaching catastrophe. Strings, percussion, voices, and alarm-like textures create the impression that the cabin's private nightmare is part of something much larger. The music expands the scale without requiring the story to leave its confined location. Silence is used strategically around that score. Brief reductions in sound do not provide comfort. They create an empty space that something must fill. Your attention becomes more sensitive. A quiet pause makes the next ordinary noise feel threatening because the film has trained you to treat the environment as active. Music and sound also help separate human fear from supernatural control. Human reactions are messy, breathless, and irregular. The force often receives a more deliberate sonic identity. Its presence feels organized. That contrast implies that the characters are improvising inside a mechanism that already understands its destination. The direction refuses to soften the conflict with frequent jokes. That decision may disappoint those who prefer the franchise's comic personality, but it gives this film remarkable tonal concentration. Every element points toward pressure: the weather, performances, color, physical effects, editing, and sound. The movie commits to its chosen identity with almost no embarrassment or retreat. Its most unforgettable scene is not simply the largest display of horror. It is the sequence built around Mia beneath the trapdoor while the others stand above her. The physical arrangement contains the whole film. She is isolated below, they are gathered above, and a boundary separates fear from recognition. They can hear her voice and see her face, but neither sound nor sight can be trusted. The trapdoor becomes the book's binding in architectural form. Both barriers attempt to contain something already released. Both invite somebody to move closer and inspect what should remain distant. The threat understands that the group's compassion, guilt, and curiosity are stronger than wood or chains. Levy controls the sequence by shifting between apparent vulnerability and unnerving certainty. David's desire to find his sister collides with the evidence that approaching her may endanger everyone. Eric's growing knowledge cannot make the choice easier. Information explains the threat but does not remove the emotional cost of responding to it. That scene is unforgettable because it does not need a complicated location or large mythology. It reduces horror to a familiar face on the wrong side of a door. The fear comes from connection, not anonymity. The group cannot protect itself without treating Mia as unreachable, and it cannot save her without risking the possibility that the person asking for help is no longer Mia. This is the film at its strongest. Performance, structure, design, and sound all expressing the same idea. A boundary has been drawn, but nobody knows whether opening it is an act of love or another fatal mistake. The movie's control is impressive, yet control also exposes its limitations. When every element is pushed toward maximum severity, quieter character needs can be crowded out, and those missing emotional compartments are where the film falls shortest. The film's greatest limitation is that its supporting characters are more functional than fully dimensional. Eric opens the book and becomes the investigator. Olivia supplies the medical explanation. Natalie provides an additional emotional stake for David. Each performs a necessary role in the mechanism, but the script gives them limited life beyond that function. This matters because horror becomes more powerful when you fear losing a person rather than merely anticipate what will happen to a body. Lou Taylor Pucci gives Eric nervous intelligence and growing guilt, but the film could have explored more deeply why he ignores such aggressive warnings. Curiosity explains the action, yet a stronger personal motive would have connected his mistake to the emotional history already surrounding the cabin. Olivia's confidence is useful because it delays supernatural recognition. However, once her medical interpretation collapses, the story gives her little space to process that failure. Jessica Lucas communicates concern and authority efficiently, but the character's internal shift happens too quickly. A moment acknowledging that her expertise helped trap Mia would have added painful self-awareness. Natalie is even less developed. Elizabeth Blackmore creates warmth in her early interactions, and her position as David's partner could have offered an outsider's view of the siblings' damaged relationship. Instead, Natalie often exists beside that conflict rather than meaningfully influencing it. When she becomes central to the escalation, the physical danger is vivid, but the emotional connection is comparatively thin. David receives more history, yet the writing sometimes relies on his guilt without giving it enough specificity. We understand that he withdrew during family hardship and that Mia resents him. What remains less clear is how that absence shaped the person he became. Shiloh Fernandez plays the burden sincerely, but the screenplay could have made his return feel like a more complicated decision rather than a straightforward attempt at repair. The pacing creates a related problem. Once the threat becomes undeniable, the film accelerates so aggressively that emotional consequences struggle to settle. One crisis is replaced by another before the surviving characters can absorb what has changed. The momentum is exciting, but constant escalation can flatten its own impact. When nearly every new beat is more intense than the previous one, intensity stops feeling like contrast and begins feeling like the default. A few quiet pauses would not have weakened the horror. They could have made it worse in the best possible way. Silence after a loss allows grief, guilt, and anticipation to occupy the room. Without enough of those pauses, some characters appear to move forward because the plot requires speed rather than because their minds have caught up. The film's addiction framework is excellent during the setup but less consistently integrated after the supernatural mechanism takes control. Mia's loss of agency continues to echo her recovery struggle, and David's disbelief remains emotionally relevant. Still, the metaphor sometimes recedes behind the mechanics of survival. More moments connecting Mia's internal determination to the external battle could have strengthened the story without turning it into a lecture. There is also a delicate issue in using withdrawal symptoms as cover for supernatural danger. The premise works dramatically because the symptoms make Mia's warnings easier to dismiss. But the film has limited time to explore recovery with nuance before horror takes over. As a result, addiction occasionally feels like a powerful plot device rather than a fully considered human experience. Levy's performance supplies sensitivity that the screenplay does not always match. Eric's decision to speak the forbidden words remains another weak point. The book does everything visually possible to communicate danger, and he proceeds with remarkably little hesitation. Thematically, this supports the film's argument that elaborate warnings provoke curiosity. Dramatically, however, the choice could have used a clear intellectual or emotional motivation. His action is essential, but its necessity to the plot is easier to see than its necessity to the character. The relentless seriousness also narrows the film's tonal range. Alvarez is right not to imitate Raimi's humor, yet moments of ordinary warmth or personality could have created stronger contrast without becoming comedy. The group needs enough shared life for the cabin's destruction of that community to feel tragic. We understand why they are present, but we do not always feel why they enjoy being together. These flaws do not destroy the experience because the craft, Levy's performance, and the central sibling relationship continue carrying it. The limited characterization matters less during the most tightly directed sequences, where physical space and immediate choices become the focus. It matters more afterward when you consider which losses stayed emotionally vivid and which were remembered mainly for their execution. The film remains highly effective at creating dread and consequence. Its missed opportunity is that it could have made every person as memorable as the nightmare consuming them. The box is constructed with precision, but some of the human compartments inside it are thinner than the machinery surrounding them. That imbalance becomes clearer when we place the film beside other cabin nightmares, possession stories, and serious horror reimaginings that made different choices about character, tone, and emotional depth. Place a 2013 Evil Dead beside Sam Raimi's 1981 original, and the first difference is not the story framework. It is the relationship between imperfection and fear. Raimi's film feels dangerous partly because its low-budget invention makes the images unpredictable. The camera moves with reckless energy, the effects possess handmade strangeness, and the actors seem trapped inside a production discovering its own limits. Alvarez works with greater visual control. His cabin has clearer geography. The physical transformations carry more realistic texture, and the escalation feels carefully engineered. This makes the remake more immediately intense but slightly less uncanny. Raimi's limitations produce images that feel as though they should not exist. Alvarez's precision produces images designed to feel physically unavoidable. The original also contains the early form of the franchise's unusual humor, even when it plays primarily as horror. The 2013 film removes nearly all of that release. It does not want nervous laughter to restore distance. Its central question is not how much chaos one person can survive while transforming into an unknightly hero. It is how long love and rational explanation can endure when both become tools for the threat. Compare it next with The Exorcist, and Possession reveals two very different dramatic functions. William Friedkin's film places possession inside a conflict involving faith, medicine, family, and institutional doubt. Its pace allows uncertainty to deepen over time. The possessed child remains the emotional center because the adult's beliefs are tested through their attempts to help her. Evil Dead compresses that uncertainty into a survival mechanism. There is little space for philosophical investigation once the cabin begins closing. Possession spreads distrust through a group rather than concentrating an entire drama around one person. Alvarez gains speed and physical urgency, but The Exorcist achieves greater emotional and spiritual depth because it gives doubt more room to evolve. Then there is The Cabin in the Woods, released shortly before Atazi's film. Both begin with young adults entering a remote cabin whose environment contains more design than they understand. But Drew Goddard's film turns familiar horror choices into a satirical system. It invites you to examine genre rules from outside while still enjoying them from within. Alvarez does the opposite. He takes recognizable cabin horror machinery and removes the protective layer of irony. The Cabin in the Woods asks why audiences and storytellers demand repeated sacrifice. Evil Dead asks whether the familiar structure can still hurt when played with complete sincerity. One opens the genre to expose the machine. The other locks you inside the machine and increases the pressure. Evil Dead Rise offers the closest modern comparison because it carries the same franchise identity into a different domestic space. Lee Cronin replaces the forest cabin with an apartment building, turning a family home and its vertical architecture into the trap. The later film gives its central family relationships more immediate definition, so the emotional bonds often feel stronger before they are attacked. The 2013 film, however, has a more elegant reason for its characters to remain. Mia's recovery plan makes disbelief and confinement part of the story before supernatural danger appears. Rice builds fear through family members recognizing someone they love and watching that person become threatening. Alvarez builds it through a woman telling the truth while her history makes the truth sound unreliable. If you love the 2013 film for its physical commitment and severe tone, Evil Dead Rise is the clearest next choice. It preserves the franchise's tactile cruelty while finding new architecture and a more explicitly domestic emotional center. After that, return to Raimi's original to see how speed, improvisation, and limited resources created the visual language Alvarez inherited. If you admired the possession theme but wanted more psychological and spiritual weight, choose The Exorcist. Its horror is slower, quieter, and more interested in what belief costs the people surrounding the victim. If the unbroken seriousness exhausted you, watch The Cabin in the Woods instead. It offers genre awareness, comedy, and conceptual play, while still understanding why isolated spaces and forbidden compartments remain effective. It will give you distance that Alvarez deliberately refuses. What distinguishes the 2013 Evil Dead from all four is the recovery premise. Other possession films use faith, family, curiosity, or accidental discovery as their primary doorway. This one uses a promise not to believe the person asking to leave. That mechanism turns care into captivity before the supernatural force needs to do anything. The film may not possess the original's handmade unpredictability, The Exorcist's spiritual depth, The Cabin in the Woods' intellectual playfulness, or Evil Dead Rises' fuller family portrait. What it offers instead is extraordinary concentration. It selects one emotional trap, surrounds it with physical craft, and refuses to loosen its grip. That severity made the film stand out in 2013, when horror remakes, franchise reboots, and a new wave of self-aware genre storytelling were all competing to define what modern audiences wanted from familiar nightmares. When Evil Dead arrived in 2013, horror remakes carried a credibility problem. The previous decade had produced numerous new versions of recognizable properties, and audiences had learned to approach them with suspicion. Familiar titles could attract immediate attention, but they also created the impression that commercial recognition mattered more than creative necessity. This film faced an even sharper version of that resistance because The Evil Dead was not merely an old studio title waiting to be refreshed. It was a cult object associated with independent filmmaking, handmade effects, Sam Raimi's visual personality, and Bruce Campbell's unusual screen presence. Replacing that combination seemed almost designed to provoke rejection. Alvarez's smartest cultural decision was refusing to compete directly with the franchise's comic identity. The 2013 film does not introduce another Ash, imitate Campbell's delivery, or recreate the later film's mixture of horror and slapstick. It returns to the first movie's promise of a punishing cabin nightmare and rebuilds that promise for an era accustomed to cleaner digital images and more self-aware genre storytelling. That choice was especially striking 1 year after The Cabin in the Woods had turned the familiar remote cabin setup into a clever examination of horror formulas. Audiences had already been invited to stand outside the machinery and laugh at its rules. Evil Dead asked them to step back inside and treat those rules seriously. The broader horror landscape was also changing. In 2013, films such as The Conjuring You're Next, Insidious Chapter 2, and Mama demonstrated that audiences were open to very different kinds of fear: classical supernatural atmosphere, home invasion tension, franchise mythology, and dark fairy tale emotion. Evil Dead claimed the most physically aggressive corner of that landscape. Its premiere at South by Southwest in March 2013 was an ideal introduction because festival enthusiasm could challenge the assumption that the remake was merely a corporate exercise. The film then opened widely in the United States on April 5 and took first place at the domestic box office during its opening weekend. Financially, the result was clear. The film earned approximately $97.5 million worldwide, including about $54.2 million domestically. Against its reported production budget of roughly $70 million, that performance demonstrated that the franchise could survive without Ash as its central theatrical attraction. Critical reception was more divided. Metacritic records a score of 57 from 38 reviews, placing the response in its mixed or average category. The film's Rotten Tomatoes critical score settled in the mid-60s. CinemaScore audiences gave it a C+, a result that suggests opening night reactions were far from universally enthusiastic. Those numbers make sense because the movie's strengths and limitations are nearly impossible to separate. The same unbroken severity that thrilled some people exhausted others. The physical effects admired as committed craftsmanship could be interpreted as excess by someone seeking psychological subtlety. Its refusal to imitate the earlier humor protected its identity, while disappointing people who regarded that humor as essential to Evil Dead. The disagreement was not simply between critics and audiences, it existed within the fan base itself. Some longtime followers saw Alvarez's seriousness as a betrayal of what the series had evolved into. Others viewed it as a recovery of the frightening quality that later entries had deliberately transformed. Newer horror fans could approach the film without that history and judge it as a modern survival nightmare. Time has improved the conditions under which the film can be appreciated. In 2013, much of the conversation asked whether it deserved to use the Evil Dead name. Later franchise entries reduced that pressure. Once Ash vs. Evil Dead restored Campbell's version of the property and Evil Dead Rise demonstrated that new characters and locations could carry it forward. Alvarez's film no longer needed to represent the only available future. Home viewing also allowed its craftsmanship to receive closer attention. Collector editions, an unrated version, and later high-resolution releases encouraged people to examine the practical work, sound design, production details, and alternate creative choices. Streaming availability introduced the film to audiences who knew Evil Dead Rise first or discovered Antoas through Don't Breathe and Alien. Romulus. That second wave discovery has helped change its reputation from controversial remake to a distinct branch of the franchise. Its influence is easier to recognize when removed from the release era demand that it either replace or faithfully reproduce Raimi's trilogy. The movie now feels like proof that the central mythology can support different tones. Awards attention reflected the same split between mainstream recognition and genre appreciation. It was not a major presence at General Film Awards, which is unsurprising for an extreme studio horror release. Within horror-focused awards, however, its craft received meaningful recognition. The film won Fred Meter Awards for makeup and special effects, while Roger Murray and Jane O'Kane received the Fangoria Chainsaw Award for Best Makeup and Creature Effects. Rookie Banyos' score also earned awards from the International Film Music Critics Association. Those wins correctly identified the production's strongest elements, but Jane Levy deserved wider attention. Her role required physical commitment, emotional credibility, and the ability to embody both vulnerability and threat without losing the connection between them. Genre performances are frequently overlooked when their technical difficulty is hidden beneath makeup and extreme circumstances. Levy's work is a human structure that keeps those elements from becoming an effects demonstration. The film feels perfectly of its era in its polished severity, recovery-centered setup, and determination to prove that a remake could be darker than the property people remembered. Yet its practical textures have helped it remain visually durable. Digital spectacle often reveals the period in which it was created. Physical interaction aged differently because weight, light, and contact remain convincing, so the movie occupies an unusual cultural position. It began as a controversial attempt to reopen a beloved object. It survived because it did not pretend to be the same object. Its reputation grew once the franchise became large enough to contain Raimi's comic chaos, Alvarez's severe physical nightmare, and later interpretations without requiring one to erase another. That changing reputation also explains why the film continues generating theories. Once audiences stopped arguing only about whether the remake should exist, they began examining whether its details connect to the older mythology and whether Mia's ordeal means more than the surface story confirms. The most persistent debate asks whether the 2013 film is truly a remake or a hidden continuation. On the surface, it repeats the original structure closely enough to look like a reimagining. A new group reaches a familiar kind of cabin, reads from a forbidden book, and experiences events that echo Raimi's film. Yet the image of Ash's rusting Oldsmobile near the cabin suggests that the earlier story may already have happened. Bruce Campbell's brief post-credits appearance strengthened the suspicion that the two versions shared a world rather than replacing one another. Fate Alvarez later supported this reading, explaining that his film continues the original and that repeated events represent a dark pattern created by the book. That means the continuity idea began as fan interpretation but gained direct support from the filmmaker. The repeated structure is not necessarily evidence of a reset. It can be understood as the evil recreating the same trap with different people. The cabin changes hands, warnings accumulate, and history repeats because each new person believes the previous disaster belongs to the past. A related theory suggests that the book in this film is not exactly the same volume seen in every other entry. Its appearance, illustrations, markings, and rules differ from earlier versions. Fans have connected those differences to the multiple books shown in Army of Darkness, proposing that separate volumes may release related forms of the same evil. The film itself neither confirms nor disproves that explanation. Its book clearly has a distinct physical history, and later franchise entries introduce other volumes with their own designs and recorded warnings. The theory therefore provides a useful way to reconcile inconsistency, but it should not be treated as a complete canon map. The franchise often values recurring patterns more than perfectly aligned rules. The strongest thematic interpretation sees Mia's possession as an external reflection of addiction. Both forces seize control, isolate her from people she loves, and make others question whether the person they know is still present. The cabin intervention begins with Mia trying to remove one destructive presence from her life, only for another to exploit the physical and emotional vulnerability created by that process. This reading holds up because the film repeatedly links recovery with agency. Mia's story is about reclaiming ownership of her choices and body. David's story is about learning that supporting her requires more than containment. The supernatural force attacks precisely where both characters feel weakest. However, the more extreme theory that the entire nightmare is a withdrawal hallucination collapses under scrutiny. The prologue establishes the force before Mia's intervention. Other characters experience events independently, and physical consequences continue outside her perception. Addiction supplies the emotional structure, it does not replace the literal supernatural story. Another popular interpretation positions Mia as a possible successor or counterpart to Ash. She enters the cabin as the person others expect to protect, but the ordeal forces her toward active resistance. Familiar franchise imagery eventually transfers to her, suggesting that survival has created a new kind of hero. The post-credits glimpse of Ash encouraged speculation that the two survivors might eventually meet. Plans for separate stories leading toward a crossover were publicly discussed during the film's release period, but that movie was never produced. Therefore, the idea that Mia and Ash canonically joined forces remains unrealized possibility rather than an event supported by the films. Symbolically, though, the comparison works. Ash survives through reckless adaptability and gradually becomes larger than the nightmare around him. Mia survives by reclaiming an identity that other people and the evil force have both attempted to define. His heroism grows from chaotic confidence, hers grows from refusing erasure. The most compelling interpretation connects all these theories through repetition. The evil does not simply possess individuals. It recreates circumstances in which human weaknesses open the door: curiosity, certainty, guilt, and the belief that a warning applies only to someone else. Different books, different survivors, and different decades become compartments inside the same pattern. That is what the film itself supports most strongly. Whether the cabin is literally the identical place matters less than the repeated human mechanism. Somebody finds evidence of disaster. Somebody believes they can understand it safely. Somebody crosses the boundary. The evil survives because each generation mistakes an old warning for a new mystery. And beneath that pattern lies the film's deeper idea. Recovery begins only when a person stops repeating the explanation that kept them trapped. Beneath the possession story, Evil Dead is about the difference between containment and healing. The characters begin by assuming that Mia's recovery can be created through barriers. Remove her access to the outside world, keep her inside the cabin, refuse every request to leave. These actions may be necessary within their plan, but the film asks whether control imposed from outside can ever substitute for transformation within. The cabin contains the same mistake on a larger scale. Its hidden lower space holds the remains of an earlier attempt to control evil through ritual destruction and physical separation. The book is lapped, wired, and marked with warnings. Every dangerous element has been placed behind some kind of boundary. Nothing has actually been resolved. The smell rising into the living space proves that buried problems continue affecting the surface. This is one of the film's simplest and strongest symbols. The group does not discover the cabin's history because they search for truth. They search for the source of something they can no longer ignore. The past announces itself as contamination. Real life often works in quieter versions of that pattern. A family can avoid discussing a painful event, but avoidance changes how its members speak to one another. A person can lock away guilt, but the guilt influences new decisions. Something does not become powerless merely because nobody names it. David embodies that truth. He left during a period when Mia needed him, and returning to the cabin cannot erase the absence. He wants the intervention to become proof that he is now dependable. But love performed to correct your self image can still fail the person you're trying to help. David must stop asking whether he is behaving like a good brother and begin asking whether he is actually seeing his sister. That distinction is painfully human. We often confuse our intention with another person's experience. We say we are helping, so resistance looks like ingratitude. We say we are protecting someone, so their fear appears irrational. The film turns that gap into horror. Mia's friends care about her, yet their certainty prevents them from hearing her. The book represents another form of certainty. Its pages appear to offer knowledge, but knowledge without humility becomes permission. Eric sees a puzzle and assumes understanding it will place him above its danger. The warnings challenge his intelligence, and the challenge becomes irresistible. That impulse exists far beyond supernatural stories. People cross boundaries because they want to prove the boundary was unnecessary. They confuse the ability to access something with the right to use it. They treat caution as ignorance and curiosity as innocence. Evil Dead responds with a brutal idea. Consequences do not care how intelligently you explained your decision to yourself. The handwritten notes deepen this meaning. Many people encountered the book before Eric. They studied it, feared it, and attempted to protect the next person. Yet their warnings compete with the object's attraction. The pages become a composition across time in which experience keeps losing to confidence. The recurring act of going downward also matters. Characters descend beneath the cabin to discover what previous occupants tried to conceal. Emotionally, David must perform a similar descent into family history. He cannot repair his relationship with Maya by remaining at the level of good intentions. He has to confront abandonment, guilt, and the possibility that his earlier choices helped create her distrust. Burial becomes the most complicated symbol because it can mean suppression, death, protection, or rebirth. Putting something underground may hide it from sight, but the film repeatedly asks whether the buried thing has truly ended. The answer depends on what is placed there and why. Denial buries a problem to avoid it. Transformation enters darkness with the possibility of emerging differently. Water carries a similar contradiction. Rain blocks escape and makes the landscape unstable, but water is also associated with cleansing. In this film, cleansing never arrives gently. Recovery is not presented as a simple return to purity. It is exhausting, frightening, and dependent on choices made after certainty has disappeared. The forest surrounds all these symbols like an external subconscious. Its paths do not offer freedom. They bend characters back toward unresolved danger. Running away from the cabin proves impossible because the viewer trap is not only geographic. Each person carries a reason for being unable to leave the central conflict behind. Mia's body becomes the film's most personal contested space. Addiction has already challenged her control over it. Withdrawal makes her physical experience difficult for others to interpret. Possession turns that loss of agency into literal horror. Yet, the story does not define Mia only through what takes control of her. Her identity is found in the resistance that remains. That makes recovery the film's true heroic language. Recovery is not returning to the person you were before pain. Mia cannot leave the cabin unchanged, just as she cannot erase her history with David. Recovery means becoming capable of choosing again after destructive forces have tried to make choice impossible. The film also recognizes that people may not believe your transformation immediately. Trust often returns more slowly than intention. Mia knows she wants another life, but her friends remember previous failure. Their doubt is not invented, yet allowing the past to define every present action denies her the possibility of change. This is where the clue trail finally reveals its emotional meaning. The book is bound because people know it is dangerous. Mia is confined because people believe freedom is dangerous for her. One boundary attempts to prevent destruction, the other attempts to create recovery. Both fail when the people enforcing them stop examining what is actually happening. Our boundary is not automatically wise because it was built from fear. It is not automatically loving because it was built with good intentions. It must remain connected to the reality it is supposed to protect. That idea reaches beyond the cabin. You may recognize it in a relationship where support became control, in a family silence mistaken for peace, or in a habit you believed was contained because nobody could see it. The film's extremity gives those ordinary failures monstrous form, but the emotional mechanism remains familiar. Healing begins when someone looks directly at the very thing, accepts responsibility without demanding immediate forgiveness, and chooses not to repeat the pattern. The warning must become more than a mark on a page. It must change behavior. That is the deeper layer inside Evil Dead. Evil enters through curiosity, but it gains power through denial. Survival becomes possible only when recognition finally catches up, and that hard earned recognition is what allowed the film to leave a lasting mark on its franchise and the horror filmmakers who followed. The legacy of the 2013 Evil Dead begins with a commercial fact. It proved that the franchise could survive a major change in identity. The film removed Ash from the central story, abandoned most of the familiar humor, introduced new characters, and still earned nearly 6 times its reported production budget worldwide. That success did not immediately produce the Maya-centered sequel many expected. Instead, the franchise expanded in several directions. Bruce Campbell returned for Ash vs. Evil Dead in 2015, allowing Raimi's comic and chaotic version of the mythology to continue on television. Then Evil Dead Rise reached cinemas in 2023 with another director, another group of characters, and an apartment building replacing the forest cabin. The connection is important. Ayabarez's film demonstrated that Evil Dead did not need to repeat one hero, location, or tone to remain recognizable. The essential identity could live inside the book. The force it releases, physical horror, hostile spaces, and ordinary people pushed toward extraordinary resistance. That model gave the franchise unusual flexibility. Many horror series depend on the repeated return of one villain. Evil Dead can instead treat evil itself as the recurring presence, while every filmmaker constructs a different human trap around it. The 2013 movie is the bridge that proved this anthology-like approach could work theatrically. Its influence on Alvarez's career is even more direct. He carried several of its strongest instincts into Don't Breathe, a contained location, clear geography, physical suspense, restricted escape, and characters whose reasonable plans become traps. In Alien Romulus, he again entered a beloved franchise with an established visual language and attempted to combine tactile production with intense modern pacing. That pattern makes Evil Dead more than his first feature. It is the film where his central directorial strengths became visible at full scale. It treats space as machinery, objects as future consequences, and physical environments as extensions of character pressure. Within horror filmmaking, the movie remains a prominent example of how practical effects can create lasting value. It arrived during a period when digital tools are increasingly available for body transformation and environmental enhancement. Alvarez did not reject digital assistance entirely, but the production's commitment to in-camera contact gave its most extreme images weight. Later horror films did not need to copy its specific imagery to share the lesson. Audiences respond to effects that performers can touch. Lighting can strike, and cameras can photograph within the same physical space. The renewed prestige of practical horror work across the following decade belongs to a wider movement. But Evil Dead became one of its most frequently remembered studio-scale examples. Its reputation has also changed in a revealing way. At release, the dominant question was whether the film respected Raimi's original. Comparison controlled nearly every conversation. Over time, the question became whether Alvarez's interpretation succeeded on its own terms. That shift allowed its severe tone, recovery premise, sound design, and Jane Levy's performance to receive more independent attention. Levy's Mia has become especially important to the film's afterlife. She is not a substitute for Ash. Her journey operates through a different emotional language. Ash becomes iconic by adapting to chaos with growing confidence. Mia becomes memorable because her fight for survival completes a struggle for agency that began before the supernatural events. That distinction broadened the franchise's idea of heroism. A survivor did not need Campbell's charisma or comic rhythm to feel appropriate inside Evil Dead. The mythology could support a character built from pain, disbelief, endurance, and recovery. The film's limitations remain visible. Its supporting characters have not gained the same cultural presence as Mia, and its seriousness can still feel narrow beside the tonal invention of Raimi's work. It did not replace the original, and history would be less interesting if it had. Its achievement is that replacement became unnecessary. The original trilogy, the 2013 film, the television continuation, and later theatrical entries can occupy different compartments of the same box. Each emphasizes another possibility inside the mythology. For film history, Evil Dead represents a remake that earned its existence through separation. It retained recognizable architecture while changing the emotional reason for entering it. That is more valuable than surface fidelity. It shows that honoring an influential film may require resisting imitation. The book in 2013, The Chew, is different because it has passed through different hands. The film's legacy works the same way. Alvarez inherited a warning written by Remy, added his own marks, and left the object available for the next filmmaker to reopen. Before we give the final verdict, however, one compartment remains sealed. The ending completes Mia's fight for agency, reveals the full purpose of the book's warnings, and transforms her original crew from a symbol of failed containment into a test of whether the cycle can finally be broken. Alright, full spoilers from this point. If you haven't seen the film yet, close this now, go watch it, and come back when you're ready. Trust me, you'll want to experience it fresh. Eric's reading awakens the force that attacks Mia in the forest and returns to the cabin inside her. This is the decisive cause behind everything that follows. Maya's addiction does not create the nightmare, but it gives the nightmare perfect camouflage. Her friends interpret the first signs as withdrawal because they entered the cabin prepared to distrust her perception. Once Mia becomes possessed, the force begins moving through the group. It does not spread like a simple illness. It exploits proximity, injury hesitation, and the impulse to help someone familiar. Olivia becomes a threat after attempting to treat Mia. Natalie is in danger because she moves close to the cellar while still hoping Mia can be reached. Compassion repeatedly opens the next compartment. Eric eventually understands that the book describes a larger ritual. The Force intends to claim 5 souls and release an abomination known as the Taker of Souls. The drawings are not decorative mythology. They foreshadow methods of destruction and show that the cabin's events are following a recorded process. This changes the meaning of the book's warnings. The notes were not written by one frightened person exaggerating an isolated experience. Different hands appear to have documented repeated attempts to understand and stop the same cycle. Eric believed he was beginning an experiment. He was actually entering a procedure that had already consumed others. Olivia and Natalie are lost as the threat escalates, while Eric survives long enough to share what he has learned. Their fates reveal one of the script's weaknesses. Their characterization is limited, but their roles inside the mechanism are precise. Olivia's medical certainty collapses. Natalie's loyalty becomes vulnerability. Eric's curiosity transforms into responsibility after the consequences can no longer be reversed. David initially considers destroying the cabin with Mia still trapped beneath it. The idea repeats the method shown in the prologue, where a father conquers a possessed version of his daughter through fire. This creates the film's most important parallel. David is being pushed toward the same conclusion. The person he loves is gone, so only destruction remains. But he cannot accept that Mia is permanently habitual. The book identifies live burial as another possible method of cleansing. David sedates Mia, places her underground, and completes the burial despite the emotional cruelty of the act. The sequence turns the film's central symbol inside out. Earlier, burial represented denial, putting something out of sight and imagining it had ended. Now David enters the burial process deliberately, not to forget Mia, but to create the possibility of bringing her back. Her body becomes still, and the possession releases its hold. David immediately digs her out and attempts to revive her using improvised electrical equipment. The plan appears to fail. For a painful moment, he has chosen belief and still lost his sister. Then Mia returns. This is not a simple supernatural reset. Her revival completes the recovery structure that began when she entered the cabin. Mia has passed through a literal death connected to the force controlling her body and awakens as herself again. She is not restored to innocence. She emerges exhausted and traumatized, but capable of choosing. David finally succeeds as a brother because he stops trying to control Mia from a distance. He risks everything on the possibility that she remains present beneath what the others can see. His faith does not erase his earlier failure, but it changes his behavior when change matters. The relief is brief. Eric's possessed body attacks David inside the cabin, and David recognizes that he cannot escape without allowing the threat to follow Mia. He locks her outside, ruptures the fuel supply, and destroys the cabin with himself and Eric inside. His sacrifice completes his personal arc. At the beginning, David's physical presence was meant to compensate for an emotional absence. At the end, he acts without expecting forgiveness, recognition, or survival. He gives Mia the opportunity to leave because her life has finally become more important than his need to repair how she sees him. Yet David's death also completes the book's count. The ground breaks open and the abomination rises in Mia's form. This is the Force's final insult. It mirrors the survivor, turning her own image into the last obstacle between her and freedom. Earlier, Mia saw a corrupted double in the forest. Now that double becomes physically separate from her. The film's identity imagery reaches its conclusion here. Possession tried to replace Mia from within. The abomination now confronts her from outside. She can finally fight the thing that has been attempting to define her. The sky releases a red storm, transforming the entire environment into the visual consequence of the book's completed ritual. The restrained color palette from the opening has disappeared. There is no remaining neutral space. The nightmare that began in a hidden basement now occupies the sky. Mia refuses to become passive again. She uses the environment, the vehicle, and the tools established earlier, but the confrontation demands a final physical cost. When her hand becomes trapped, she chooses survival over surrender and frees herself through sheer determination. The moment deliberately recalls the franchise's history of body loss while giving it a different emotional meaning. For Ash, losing a hand becomes part of constructing a larger-than-life warrior identity. For Mia, the injury represents refusing to let any remaining attachment hold her inside the cycle. She has already escaped addiction, disbelief, possession, confinement, and death. The abomination attempts one final form of restraint. She rejects it. Mia then uses the chainsaw to destroy the creature. The image is unmistakably Evil Dead, but Alvarez has earned it through her specific journey. The chainsaw does not turn Mia into a copy of Ash. It confirms that the franchise's symbolic weapon can belong to someone whose heroism was built through recovery rather than comic bravado. As the abomination is defeated, the storm stops and the ground closes. Mia walks away from the ruined cabin alone. The book remains behind, which prevents the ending from claiming that evil has been permanently erased. She has broken its control over her, not destroyed the larger cycle. That distinction makes the ending satisfying without making it falsely comforting. Recovery is victory, but it does not remove the existence of destructive forces. Mia survives because she reclaims choice. The book survives because another person may still mistake its warnings for an invitation. Several hidden details support this reading. The book's illustrations anticipate the methods used against the possessed and the final confrontation. The rusted Oldsmobile connects the cabin to Ash's history, suggesting that this place has hosted the pattern before. Familiar camera movements the damaged hand, and the chainsaw trace a visual path back through the franchise without requiring Mia's story to repeat Ash's personality. The post-credits moment shows Bruce Campbell as Ash delivering his signature reaction. It functions primarily as a brief salute, but it also encouraged the possibility that Ash and Mia existed within one continuity. Alvarez later supported the continuation interpretation. making the rusting car more than a random decorative reference. My reaction to the ending is that it saves the film from being remembered only as an expertly constructed ordeal. The final movement gives me an agency after spending much of the story trapped inside other people's explanations. Its extremity has narrative purpose. The world becomes impossibly hostile, and she still chooses herself. The bound book was our first clue. Every layer showed somebody trying to contain danger without understanding why containment had previously failed. Mia succeeds through something different. She does not merely lock the threat away. She confronts it, separates her identity from it, and walks forward while the old mechanism remains behind. The box does not close because evil has vanished. It closes because Mia is no longer inside it. My personal rating for Evil Dead is 5.5 out of 10. That score reflects a film I respect technically more than I connect with emotionally. Fida Alvarez directs with confidence. Aaron Morton's cinematography turns the cabin into a visual trap, and the practical effects give every confrontation convincing physical weight. Roque Banhos' score and the aggressive sound design create an experience that is difficult to ignore. Jane Levy is the strongest reason to watch. She carries the film through fear, anger, physical exhaustion, transformation, and survival, while preserving a recognizable emotional line between those stages. Mia's recovery gives the familiar cabin premise a fresh mechanism, and the final movement rewards her with genuine agency. The film also deserves credit for refusing to imitate Sam Raimi's comic personality. It understands that another Ash would only feel like a weaker copy. Instead, Alvarez builds a severe nightmare around damaged trust, ignored warnings, and the danger of confusing control with care. That creative separation gives the remake or continuation its own identity. But the movie's intensity cannot completely hide its thinner human material. Eric, Olivia, and Natalie mainly serve the plot's machinery. David's guilt is emotionally useful but not explored with enough depth. Once the threat becomes undeniable, the pacing leaves little room for grief or reflection. The film keeps finding stronger physical images without always finding equally strong character moments. That imbalance limits the impact for me. I remember what happened to several characters more clearly than I remember who they were. Horror becomes most powerful when craft and emotional attachment reinforce each other. Here, the craft frequently carries weight that the screenplay should have shared. You should watch Evil Dead if you enjoy contained supernatural horror, practical makeup effects, oppressive atmosphere, and movies that maintain pressure without offering much relief. It is also worth seeing if you appreciate remakes that preserve a premise while changing its emotional strategy. Longtime franchise fans should approach it as a separate tonal compartment. If you require Ash, wild comedy, and Remy's playful visual chaos, this may feel too controlled and joyless. If you prefer the frightening roughness of the first film over the later comedy, Alvarez's interpretation may connect more strongly. You may want to avoid it if disturbing physical imagery overwhelms your ability to engage with a story. The movie is intentionally exhausting, and its advertiser-friendly analysis should not disguise the severity of the original material. Anyone seeking slow psychological development or richly detailed supporting characters may also find the experience emotionally narrow. For most people, streaming is the best first option. The film's concentrated intensity works well as a single home viewing, especially with good sound. If the practical craftsmanship, score, and franchise history already appeal to you, a high-quality physical edition is worth owning for repeat examination and production features. The film does not replace Remy's original, and it never needed to. Its real achievement is proving that the same forbidden book can open into a completely different kind of nightmare. The Wire failed to keep the book closed, but Maya proved that escaping its story was still possible. Every film is a box, and we opened this one together. Thank you for staying with me through every compartment of Evil Dead. This was a difficult film to open because its loudest images can easily hide its most interesting idea. People do not always ignore warnings because they are callous. Sometimes they ignore them because curiosity feels intelligent, control feels loving, and the explanation they already trust feels safer than the truth developing in front of them. If this breakdown gave you a new way to see Mia, David, The Cabin, or That Bound Book, support the Film Box by liking the video and subscribing. It genuinely helps us continue creating detailed film analysis that moves beyond plot and examines how performance, filmmaking, and meaning connect. Now I want to hear your answer to one question. Was David's refusal to abandon Mia an act of true faith in his sister, or did his guilt simply delay the decision until everyone else had already paid the price? Share your interpretation in the comments. There is no easy answer, and that is exactly why the question matters. Read the arguments from other film lovers, challenge the details respectfully, and tell me whether this movie deserved a higher or lower rating than 5.5 out of 10. Thank you for opening this one with me, staying curious and looking beyond the surface. Every film is a box, and we've only just started opening them. That's the Film Box. See you in the next one.